The year was 1857, and the promise of gold still lingered in the air of California's rugged Sierra Nevada foothills. By then, the great rush that had once drawn tens of thousands westward was beginning to fade, yet the rivers and gulches still drew men with dreams of fortune. But on one bitter autumn morning, those dreams gave way to something far darker. A group of miners, making their way down a narrow trail toward the camp at Grass Valley, stumbled upon a sight that would freeze their blood. Face down in a shallow creek, half submerged in icy water, lay the body of a man. His clothes were torn, his boots missing, his gold pouch gone. The creek babbled around him as if nothing were amiss, the sound masking the stillness of death. Only the cold stiffness of his limbs, the pale skin beneath the surface, spoke the truth. The miners, hardened men accustomed to hardship and loss, stood in silence. Death was not rare in the mining country. Accidents, disease, and violence were grim companions of life on the frontier. But this was different. The body bore no marks of a drunken brawl, no evidence of a cave-in or fall. Instead, there was a single wound across the skull, a crushing blow delivered with precision and intent. Someone had killed him. One of the men, a seasoned prospector named Samuel Reeve, bent down and turned the corpse just enough to see his face. Recognition flickered. The victim was Elias Harper, a quiet, solitary miner who had struck a modest vein only days before. Reeve had seen him celebrating in the saloon, gold dust glittering in his pouch. And now here he was, lifeless, his hard-earned fortune vanished into the hands of another. Word spread quickly through the camp. Harper was not the first. In recent months, whispers had circulated of men disappearing on lonely trails, their bodies later discovered stripped of wealth. Each death was blamed on chance, on the hazards of travel, or the cruelty of the wilderness. Yet patterns were emerging. Always the same details: a missing pouch, tools abandoned, wounds inflicted with brutal efficiency. The miners spoke of it in hushed voices by the campfires. Some called it bad luck. Others said it was the work of roving bandits preying on the isolated and unprotected. But a darker name began to surface, a phrase muttered with unease: the Gold Rush Killer. Fear seeped into the fabric of camp life. Men who once strode confidently into the hills now traveled in pairs, rifles slung across their shoulders. Saloons emptied earlier, trails were avoided after sunset, and strangers were met with suspicion. Yet despite the unease, no one knew who the killer was or when he might strike again. For the sheriffs and constables who roamed the mining districts, these were frustrating times. Their numbers were too few, their jurisdictions scattered across vast untamed wilderness. Bodies were found days, even weeks after death, the trails washed clean by rain or trampled by passing herds. Clues, if any, were scant. Justice was a fragile thing in the gold country, easily lost to the shadows, and in those shadows, someone was watching. Someone who knew the land well, who struck without hesitation and who vanished as quickly as he came. At first, no one connected the killings to Jacob Fenwick. To most, he was just another prospector, a quiet man from Missouri who kept to himself. He gambled modestly, drank sparingly, and complained often of his bad luck at the diggings. Nothing about him suggested a monster. But for those who later pieced together the truth, it became clear that Fenwick had been there all along, present in the background, silent, patient, waiting. By the time Elias Harper's body was pulled from that creek, Fenwick's trail of violence had already begun. The deaths once thought random were in fact deliberate, calculated. Harper would not be the last, and so the question arose, whispered through the camps and echoed in every fearful glance along the lonely trails. Who was Jacob Fenwick? Was he simply another desperate man, driven to madness by hunger and failure, or was he something else entirely? A predator who thrived in the lawless chaos of the gold country, turning the dream of fortune into a nightmare of blood. What began as whispers would soon become a roar. The gold rush had promised riches, but in its shadows lurked a truth far more sinister. The story of Jacob Fenwick, the Gold Rush Killer, was only just beginning. To understand Jacob Fenwick and the murders that would later stain his name, we must first understand the world that shaped him. The California Gold Rush was not simply an event, it was a fever, a madness that swept through the world like wildfire. Beginning in 1849, it drew men and women from across the United States, from South America, Europe, even China. By the time Fenwick arrived, nearly a decade later, the rush had lost its frenzy but not its grip. The hills still echoed with the clang of picks against stone, the murmur of sluices and the restless hunger for fortune. The mining towns were hives of ambition and despair. Wooden shacks leaned crookedly against muddy streets, their windows glowing faintly with lamplight. Saloons spilled laughter and curses into the night, the air thick with tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey, and the sharp tang of sweat. Outside, horses stamped nervously against hitching posts while dogs fought over scraps in the alleys. Yet beneath the bustle lay an air of suspicion, men carrying pistols on their hips, eyes darting to the bulges in each other's pockets where gold pouches might be hidden. For many, gold was never found. Most claims produced little more than gravel, forcing miners to scrape by on meager rations of beans, hard bread, and coffee. Illness spread quickly in the close quarters of the camps, and accidents in the mines claimed lives almost daily. It was a world built on the promise of sudden riches, but it delivered far more sorrow than success. And in such conditions, men were pushed to their limits by desperation, by envy, by greed. It was into this crucible that Jacob Fenwick stepped. Born in 1825 in Missouri, Fenwick was the son of a struggling farmer. His childhood was marked by hard labor, endless seasons of tilling dry soil, and the steady grind of poverty. His father, stern and unyielding, drilled into him a belief that a man's worth was measured only by what he could seize from the land. But the family farm never thrived, and by the time Jacob reached his early 20s, he was already restless, bitter, and searching for something beyond the boundaries of his father's fields. When news of gold in California reached Missouri, Fenwick saw it as more than opportunity. It was escape. He left behind his family, shouldering only a few belongings and the determination to carve his name from the earth. His journey west was grueling. Months of wagon travel, blistering heat across the plains, and nights spent under the endless stars. Those who traveled with him later remembered him as quiet, often withdrawn, but with eyes that seemed to linger on others' belongings just a moment too long. By 1854, Fenwick had reached the Sierra Nevada foothills. The rush had cooled by then, but fortune still beckoned to those willing to endure backbreaking labor. Fenwick staked small claims near Nevada City and Grass Valley, but his luck was poor. Weeks of digging yielded little more than flecks of gold, not nearly enough to cover the cost of tools and supplies. Others around him struck rich veins, celebrating with whiskey and cards in the saloons, while Fenwick nursed his failures in silence. Those who knew him in the camps described him as polite, but guarded. He drank little, gambled rarely, and never spoke of family back home. He would vanish for days at a time, returning with excuses of prospecting far upriver, though his pans were often empty. He seemed to watch others more than he worked, studying their routines, their claims, their wealth. The gold rush was fertile ground for such a man. It was a world where law barely existed, where justice was crude and swift, where men disappeared without question. Saloons and taverns were filled with drifters and strangers whose names were easily forgotten. It was not unusual for someone to vanish and never return, leaving only unanswered questions in their wake. But beneath Fenwick's quiet exterior, something darker was forming. His failures at the diggings gnawed at him. Each time he saw another miner strike it rich, a seed of envy rooted deeper. The gold rush was supposed to reward the hard-working, the patient, the determined. Yet Fenwick saw only his own empty pans, his blistered hands, his hunger growing sharper by the day. Whispers from the time suggest he began speaking less of finding gold and more of taking it. In saloons, when whiskey loosened his tongue, he was said to mutter about the unfairness of fortune, how some men stumbled upon wealth while others starved. He spoke of opportunity in strange ways, of chance meetings on lonely trails, of men burdened by heavy pouches. In this world of fleeting wealth and fragile trust, Jacob Fenwick was not immediately remarkable. He was one of thousands, a face among the many who came west chasing dreams, but it was in this anonymity that he thrived. No one noticed when he slipped away into the night. No one questioned his sudden appearances or unexplained absences, and so the stage was set. The gold rush had created the perfect storm of greed, desperation, and lawlessness, and in its midst, Jacob Fenwick began to shape his own fortune, one not carved from the rivers and rocks, but from the blood and gold of other men. The killings had not yet begun, but the tension was building. The camps, restless and suspicious, were primed for fear, and soon the first victim would vanish into the silence of the Sierra trails. The Sierra Nevada was a place of beauty, but also of isolation. Its thick pine forests, rushing creeks, and treacherous trails could turn from picturesque to deadly in a single heartbeat. It was within this landscape that Jacob Fenwick began his descent from a failed prospector into a predator who thrived on the desperation of others. The first victim tied to him was Elias Harper. Harper had been a familiar figure in the camps, a man in his early 30s who kept to himself but occasionally shared a drink with the other miners. In the autumn of 1857, Harper struck a modest but promising vein near a tributary outside Grass Valley. Witnesses recalled his excitement in the saloon, gold dust glittering in the lamplight as he bought drinks for others, his voice filled with rare enthusiasm. It was perhaps the worst mistake of his life. Days later, he was found face down in the shallow creek, skull caved in, his gold pouch gone. At the time, suspicion was vague. Bandits were known to prowl the hills, and death on the trail was common. But weeks later, another miner vanished, James Barlow, a wiry New Englander. He was last seen leaving camp with his week's takings, heading toward Nevada City to resupply. His body surfaced 3 days later, lying in a gulch not far from the main trail. The scene was nearly identical. His head struck by a blunt object, his pouch stolen. Patterns began to emerge, though few were ready to admit it. The killings happened on lonely trails between camps, never within the crowded heart of the towns. The victims were always solitary men, often flush with gold, targeted when their guard was down. Whoever the killer was, he struck with precision, vanishing before help could arrive. By early 1858, the toll had grown. 3 more miners were discovered dead, 2 along the Yuba River, 1 near the outskirts of Nevada City. Each death followed the same brutal script. By now, whispers filled the saloons. The Gold Rush Killer, they called him, though none knew his face. Men began to travel in pairs, rifles slung across their backs, scanning the tree line with suspicion. But the killings did not stop. Jacob Fenwick blended into this growing fear. He worked his claim by day, though it yielded little. By night he roamed. Some later speculated he stalked his victims for hours, watching them leave camp, learning their habits. He was not a man of impulse. His crimes carried a pattern of planning. He chose isolated locations, narrow gullies where sound would not carry, creeks where blood washed quickly into the current. His weapon was simple yet effective, a miner's pick or a heavy rock. Blunt, brutal, final. But Fenwick's crimes were not without risk. One chilling incident nearly unmasked him. In the spring of 1858, a prospector named Nathaniel Briggs was ambushed on the trail. He later recounted how a shadow emerged from the trees, striking him across the head. The blow did not kill him. Dazed and bleeding, Briggs managed to fire a shot into the night, wounding his assailant before stumbling back toward camp. Though he never saw his attacker's face, he remembered the details. A man with rough, scarred hands, his voice carrying the accent of Missouri. The description was vague, but for the first time suspicion narrowed. Few in the camps were from Missouri. Fewer still bore scars across their hands. Rumors swirled, names whispered, and one of them was Jacob Fenwick's. But with no evidence, and in a land where justice was as scarce as water, suspicion was not enough. The killings continued. By late 1858, Fenwick's tally may have reached into the double digits. Some victims were never found, only spoken of in rumors. Men who left camp and never returned, their names fading into silence. But others were undeniable. Their bodies discovered by passers-by, their fates whispered of in the camps. Each new killing deepened the fear. The crimes did more than take lives, they eroded trust. In the saloons and bunkhouses, men who once shared food and stories now eyed one another with suspicion. Travelers demanded to know their companions' names, origins, and intentions. Strangers were turned away, sometimes beaten or worse. The killer had not only stolen gold but poisoned the fragile bonds of community that kept the camps alive. And through it all, Fenwick remained just another face in the crowd. He was seen nursing drinks in the corner of a tavern, his expression unreadable. He was spotted at card tables, losing modest sums, never boasting, never revealing himself. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried a bitterness that some recalled only in hindsight, a quiet resentment at others' fortune, a sense that the world owed him more. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed his absences coincided with the killings. They might have wondered why a man with such poor claims was never quite destitute. But in the chaotic swirl of the gold rush, few kept such accounts. Fenwick had found the perfect hunting ground. The wilderness concealed his movements, the chaos concealed his identity, and the greed of others provided endless victims. Yet as the killings mounted, so too did the pressure. The miners demanded justice, the sheriffs formed posses, and the communities, weary of fear, began to fight back. For Jacob Fenwick, the days of striking in silence were drawing to a close, but before his downfall, his crimes would grow bolder still. By 1859, the gold rush camps of Nevada County lived under a shadow darker than hunger or failure. Men no longer feared only the unforgiving earth or the emptiness of barren claims. They feared each other. Rumors of the gold rush killer had hardened into grim conviction. No longer dismissed as campfire tales, the murders were undeniable, and pressure mounted for justice. Local sheriffs, often elected by the very miners they now served, faced an almost impossible task. Their resources were meager, their reach limited. The mountains were vast, trails countless, and the killer seemed to vanish like smoke after each attack. Some attempts at justice ended in tragedy. More than once, mobs of miners seized drifters on suspicion of murder, only for those men to protest their innocence until the noose silenced them. In lawless places, fear often replaced evidence. And still the killings continued. The break in the case came not through lawmen but through survival. In early 1860, a miner named Matthew Cotter stumbled into the Grass Valley camp, bloodied, half-conscious, his face split open from a heavy blow. Against all odds, he had survived an attack on a lonely trail. The camp doctor stitched his wounds, and when Cotter regained his strength, he described the man who ambushed him. His voice was weak but certain. The attacker was broad-shouldered, with scarred hands, a rough beard, and a Missouri accent. Cotter swore the man had demanded his pouch before striking. He remembered the coldness in the man's eyes, an expression without hesitation or remorse. For the first time, a description matched the whispers already circulating. Jacob Fenwick. At first, suspicion was whispered in corners. Fenwick had long been considered unlucky rather than dangerous, but now men recalled details that fit the survivor's account. His Missouri origins, his scarred hands earned, he once claimed, in a farm accident, his habit of disappearing for days, returning with small amounts of gold despite barren claims. One prospector swore he'd seen Fenwick with nuggets larger than his claim could ever yield, while another remembered him gambling with coin he had no right to possess. The sheriffs, pressed by a fearful populace, began to watch Fenwick more closely. Deputies shadowed him in town, noting his visits to the assay office where he sold gold dust far richer than his claim should have produced. Quietly, they traced some of this gold back to pouches marked or recognized by others, property once belonging to the dead. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was mounting. Then came the final mistake. In the spring of 1860, Fenwick attempted to sell a pouch of dust in Nevada City. The assayer, an experienced man who had handled the belongings of many miners, recognized the leatherwork immediately. It had belonged to James Barlow, murdered 2 years before. The pouch bore faint initials scratched inside the flap, initials the assayer had noted long ago when Barlow first deposited his gold. Alarmed, he alerted the sheriff. With this revelation, the case against Fenwick grew undeniable. A posse was formed. Dozen men, rifles loaded, their resolve hardened by years of fear. They tracked Fenwick to a saloon on the outskirts of Nevada City, where he sat nursing a whiskey alone in the corner. The sheriff, a stout man named William Dixon, entered first, flanked by his deputies. The saloon quieted, all eyes on the tense standoff. Dixon approached Fenwick slowly, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. "Jacob Fenwick," he said, his voice steady. "You'll stand with us now. Too many men have died. Too many questions to answer." Fenwick looked up, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, silence stretched across the room. Some swore they saw his hand twitch toward the knife at his belt. Others claimed he only stared, cold and unreadable. But with the posse closing in, he offered no resistance. He stood, shackled without a fight, his face expressionless. The miners crowded outside as Fenwick was led into the street, chains glinting in the lamplight. Some shouted curses, others demanded his immediate hanging. But Dixon held firm. The law, though fragile in these hills, would see its course. Fenwick would stand trial, and for the first time, the killings would be given a name, a face, a man. Yet even in chains, Fenwick spoke little. When pressed about the murders, he denied them all, insisting he was no killer, that he had merely been lucky in his prospecting. His calmness unsettled many. Was it defiance or the chilling certainty of a man who believed he could not be touched? The camps buzzed with anticipation. After years of fear, the alleged gold rush killer was finally caught, but suspicion alone would not be enough to convict him. The trial ahead would reveal whether Jacob Fenwick was indeed the predator who haunted the Sierra trails, or whether the darkness of the gold rush ran deeper still. When Jacob Fenwick was dragged from Nevada City in irons, the miners believed the nightmare was over. But in the turbulent world of the gold rush, justice was never simple. What followed was not merely the trial of a man, it was the trial of an entire era, a reckoning for a community that had lived too long in fear. In the spring of 1861, Fenwick was brought to Sacramento to face justice. The courthouse swelled with crowds. Farmers, prospectors, merchants, even families filled the benches, their faces taut with anticipation. Some came to see justice done, others out of morbid curiosity. For years, the gold rush killer had been little more than a whispered legend, a shadow haunting the trails. Now that shadow had a name, a body, a pair of piercing eyes that scanned the courtroom with unnerving calm. The evidence, though circumstantial, was powerful. The prosecution laid out a chain of stolen property, gold dust traced back to men long dead, and testimonies from those who had seen Fenwick with wealth far beyond the means of his barren claim. The assayer's account of James Barlow's marked pouch carried particular weight. It was undeniable proof that Fenwick had possessed property that did not belong to him. Then came the testimony of survivors. Nathaniel Briggs, his head scarred from the blow he had endured, described the attack on the trail. His voice trembled, but his memory was sharp. The Missouri accent, the scarred hands, the eyes that glimmered with cold intent. Matthew Cotter, the miner who had stumbled into Grass Valley bloodied but alive, gave a similar account. Both pointed to Fenwick as their assailant. The defense, sparse and desperate, argued that Fenwick had been framed or mistaken for another. They painted him as a hard-working but unlucky miner, a man envied for the occasional streak of fortune. Fenwick himself remained calm throughout, insisting on his innocence. When asked to explain the possession of stolen pouches, he offered vague stories of trades and chance purchases. His words carried little conviction. The trial stretched for weeks, each day peeling back more of the fear that had festered in the mining country. For many, it was not simply about Fenwick. It was about restoring a sense of order, about proving that law could still tame the wilderness. The jury, composed of men hardened by frontier life, deliberated for less than a day. Their verdict was unanimous, guilty of multiple counts of murder and robbery. When the sentence was read, death by hanging, Fenwick did not flinch. Witnesses recalled him standing tall, his expression unreadable. Some said he looked defiant, others that he appeared relieved, as though the chase was finally over. He was returned to his cell to await execution, the miners' demand for justice finally nearing its conclusion. On a cool morning in June 1861, Jacob Fenwick was led to the gallows in Sacramento. Hundreds gathered, spilling into the streets, their breath clouding in the early light. Some came out of duty, others to witness history, others still to see the end of the man who had haunted their nights. Fenwick mounted the platform with measured steps. When asked if he had final words, he spoke clearly, his Missouri accent cutting through the hush. "I never killed no man. The land took them, not I. This country is cursed, and it will claim more yet." His denial, steady to the last, unsettled some in the crowd. Then the noose was placed around his neck, the hood drawn, and with the drop of the trapdoor, Jacob Fenwick's life ended. The crowd dispersed slowly, a silence hanging over them. Relief mingled with unease. The gold rush killer was gone, yet doubts lingered. Some wondered if Fenwick had spoken a twisted truth, that the land itself had consumed men, that violence was an inescapable part of the rush for riches. Others questioned whether every death truly belonged to Fenwick, or if fear had woven his legend larger than reality. In the mining camps, life continued. Trails were still dangerous, greed still drove men to desperate acts, and not every disappearance could be explained. But the execution of Jacob Fenwick became a turning point, a warning etched into the memory of the gold rush. He became a tale told by firelight, a story passed down in saloons and bunkhouses, a reminder of how fortune's promise could give way to blood. To historians, Fenwick's story is both cautionary and symbolic. It reflects the fragility of law on the frontier, the dangers of isolation, and the corrosive power of envy. To those who lived through it, however, it was simpler: the end of a killer who had stalked their nights, and the fragile return of safety to their camps. Even now, more than a century later, his name lingers in the darker corners of California's gold rush history. Jacob Fenwick, farmer's son, failed prospector, and the man who turned the promise of gold into a trail of death. The gold rush had promised riches beyond measure, but in its shadow it birthed a truth that cannot be forgotten. Fortune and ruin walked hand in hand, and sometimes, as in the case of Jacob Fenwick, ruin wore a human face.